She came from wealth, from comfort, from a world that had everything, except meaning, and yet she chose the coldest, loneliest mountain to find something real. But the man who owned that land didn't trust kindness, didn't believe in second chances, and certainly didn't believe in love. So why would a woman with everything ask for less than she deserved? And what secret was she really carrying into his life? Now let's begin.
The October fog did not merely settle on the Colorado highlands. It clung to it, damp and heavy, as if trying to drag the earth down into the coming winter. Callum Hare wrapped the rusted barbed wire around the tensioner, his breath pluming in the freezing dawn air. He hauled back on the lever. The wire let out a high-pitched metallic squeal, the only sound for miles, save for the wind cutting through the burnt autumn grass. His hands moved with the mechanical precision of a man who had done this 1,000 times, but his mind was elsewhere. He was calculating. It was a familiar, nauseating arithmetic. The money left, the days remaining, and the rapidly shrinking distance between those two numbers, and the date the bank cheerfully referred to as the final deadline. He didn't need to look at the corner of the barn to know it was there. Tucked neatly beneath a smooth river stone lay a piece of paper. Notice of foreclosure. Territorial Bank. Final warning, 60 days. He had read it 3 times last night by the dying light of the hearth. He didn't need to read it again. Callum shifted his weight, driving the heel of his boot into the wet soil for leverage. Deep in the inner pocket of his waxed canvas coat resting against his chest was another piece of paper. Folded into rigid quarters, it wasn't a list of ranch chores. It was a drafted contract clause, written in the neat, precise script of a Denver land attorney. In the margins, faded pencil marks spelled out annotations in Latin. He carried it every day. He had never finished it. He drove a staple into the locust post, the sharp crack of the hammer echoing across the empty valley. 340 acres, $2,200 in debt. He needed a hired hand to beat the frost, to get the last of the herd sorted, and the eastern fencing mended before the snow buried them all. But labor required coin, and coin was a ghost on this mountain. He had ridden down to the valley last week, asking 3 different men, 3 different shakes of the head. The last one, an old drover with a missing thumb, had spat tobacco into the dust and looked at Callum with eyes that lacked any malice, which somehow made it worse. "Hare, you ain't paying a wage," the man had said. "You're paying pity, and I got a family to feed." Callum hadn't argued. He had simply nodded, turned his horse around, and ridden back up the mountain. But it wasn't just about the money. If it were just the money, he would have surrendered the deed, cut his losses, and gone back to the city where hands were used for holding pens, not axes. It was about Daniel. In 1868, Daniel hadn't died a hero's death. There had been no shootout, no noble sacrifice on the frontier. He had died in a narrow bed, his lungs slowly filling with fluid until he drowned in the dry mountain air. Callum remembered the smell of camphor and sweat, and the vice-like grip of his older brother's fevered hand. "Don't let them take our land, Cal. Don't let them have it. Don't let..." Callum had walked out of his Denver law firm the next day. He traded his tailored suits for denim, his legal briefs for a plow, and buried his brother on the hill facing the sunrise. For 10 years he had kept the world at bay. For 10 years he had wanted no one, needed no one, and fought the mountain alone. Now he was losing. And the unbearable weight in his chest wasn't the fear of losing the dirt. It was the shame of facing a dead man empty-handed. By noon, the fog had burned off, leaving a pale, indifferent sky. Callum saddled his roan and rode the 5 miles down into Ridge Creek. The town was a muddy scar of civilization clinging to the riverbank. He tied his horse outside Harlan Boggs' general store, ignoring the stares of the locals. In Ridge Creek, the name Callum Hare was synonymous with arrogant, and that city fool who doesn't know when to quit. He walked into the store, the bell above the door announcing him to the smell of cured ham, kerosene, and stale coffee. Callum walked straight to the bulletin board near the window. He pulled a thumbtack from his pocket and pressed a small, meticulously written square of paper into the cork. Hand wanted, room, board, $8 per month. Harlan Boggs, wiping the counter with a greasy rag, squinted at the board. The storekeeper let out a low whistle. $8, Callum? Even the drunkards at the saloon make more than that sweeping floors. Who the hell is going to take a job for $8 on that godforsaken ridge of yours? Callum didn't answer. He adjusted the collar of his coat, bought a pound of coffee beans he could barely afford, and walked out. He didn't want anyone up there anyway. He just needed a body with 2 working arms to delay the inevitable. The next morning, the air was sharp enough to cut glass. Callum was behind the barn, the rhythmic thwack of his axe splitting pine logs. The physical exertion was a welcome distraction from the numbers spinning in his head. Thwack! The sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel path cut through the rhythm. Callum didn't stop. He didn't turn around. He assumed it was the wind or perhaps a stray dog from the valley. He raised the axe again. "I saw your notice." The axe halted midair. It wasn't a man's voice. It wasn't hesitant, and it certainly wasn't begging. It was clear, steady, and cut straight through the freezing air. Callum lowered the axe slowly. He turned, the muscles in his jaw ticking. Standing 4 paces away was a woman. She looked to be around 30, her dark hair tied back severely, offering no softness to the sharp angles of her face. She wore sturdy canvas work pants, a faded wool coat that looked too broad for her shoulders, and a pair of worn leather boots that had clearly seen their share of winters. She carried no trunk, no hat box, just a single weathered canvas bag slung over her shoulder. Callum stared at her. He looked down at the heavy splitting axe in his hands, then back up at her. His brow furrowed in deep, instinctive rejection. This was a joke. Boggs must have sent her to mock him. "I'm not running a charity," Callum said, his voice rough from disuse. "And I need a ranch hand, not a housekeeper." The woman didn't flinch. She didn't look offended. Her eyes, the color of wet slate, held his gaze evenly. "I didn't ask to clean your floors, Mr. Hare. I said I saw your notice. I'm here for the job." Callum let out a harsh breath, shaking his head. "It's heavy work. Fencing, hauling feed, splitting wood. I can't pay you to learn, and I won't pay you to quit halfway through the week." "I don't quit," she said simply. "And I don't need $8. Callum froze. He narrowed his eyes, searching her face for the trick. "What?" "I'll take the job," she repeated, her tone completely devoid of dramatics. "But I only need $6 a month, not 8. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Callum looked at her hands. They were bare, pale in the cold, but he could see the calluses at the base of her fingers. She stood completely still, waiting. She wasn't an act of desperation, she was an act of intent. Callum's mind rebelled. He wanted to tell her to turn around. He wanted to maintain the absolute punishing isolation he had built around himself for a decade. The mountain was his, the failure was his, the ghosts were his. He didn't want anyone trespassing on his ruin. But the image of the bank notice flashed behind his eyes. 60 days. He was out of time, out of pride, and out of choices. He needed labor. She was the only one standing in his yard. They both knew it. "Fine," Callum clipped, his voice laced with suppressed frustration. "Be in the barn in 10 minutes. He turned his back on her before she could reply, bringing the axe down on a block of pine with enough force to shatter it into splinters. That evening, the ranch house was suffocatingly quiet. Callum sat alone in the dim light of the hearth. He had shown her to the small, drafty room at the end of the hall. He had given her a list of rules that were mostly just variations of "stay out of my way." She had nodded, unpacked her single bag, and immediately gone to the barn to oil the harnesses without being asked. He stared into the flames, a glass of cheap whiskey untouched on the table beside him. A stranger was sleeping under his roof. A woman. Every instinct he had honed over the last 10 years was screaming at him, crawling under his skin like a fever. He hated the slight creak of the floorboards down the hall. He hated that the absolute silence of his grief had been broken. But more than his irritation, something else gnawed at the back of his mind. A lawyer's instinct, buried deep but never entirely dead. He took a sip of the whiskey, the burn doing nothing to distract him. People were greedy. People were desperate. People fought for every last cent they could bleed from a stone. So why, Callum wondered as the fire popped and hissed in the grate? Would anyone voluntarily ask for less than they were worth? There was no contract. There was barely a conversation. On her first morning, Callum met Nora in the hallway before the sun had even breached the eastern ridge. He held a kerosene lantern, casting long, harsh shadows against the peeling wallpaper. "Small room at the end of the hall is yours," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet house. "Breakfast is at 5:30. Work starts at 6. No smoking inside." Nora nodded once. She didn't complain about the draft that rattled her window pane, nor the mattress that was little more than stuffed horsehair. "May I use the stove in the afternoons?" she asked. Callum hesitated. It was the first question she had asked that he didn't immediately have an answer to. The kitchen was his domain, purely by default of his isolation. He hadn't cooked a proper meal in years. He boiled coffee, fried salted pork, and baked hardtack. The thought of someone else moving around in that space, touching the iron, shifting the pots, made a muscle in his jaw twitch. But he nodded curtly. "Just don't waste the firewood." That was the extent of their arrangement. What followed was a silent war of attrition, fought not with words but with the stubborn habits of two people who were entirely too used to being alone. Callum was a man governed by rigid, unyielding routines. They were the scaffolding that kept his mind from collapsing into the grief of the past decade. Every morning for 3 years, he had eaten his breakfast standing beside the cast-iron stove. It was efficient. It saved time. It kept him moving. On Nora's second morning, she was already in the kitchen when he came down. The smell of actual bacon grease and toasted oats hung in the air, rich and jarringly domestic. Without a word, she placed 2 mismatched ceramic bowls on the scarred wooden dining table in the center of the room. Then she sat down. She didn't invite him. She didn't look at him expectantly. She simply began to eat. Callum stood by the stove, his own plate in hand, feeling entirely ridiculous. He looked at the empty chair opposite her. He looked at the space on the table. He hadn't sat at that table since Daniel died. To sit meant to linger, and lingering meant remembering. But standing there while she sat made him feel like a displaced farmhand in his own home. Stiffly, he walked over and sat down. The wood of the chair creaked in surprise. They ate in absolute silence, the only sounds the scraping of spoons and the howling wind outside. When he finished, Callum took his bowl to the wash basin. He didn't say thank you, but later that morning, as he swung his hammer repairing the corral, he found he was working with a steady, unrelenting energy he hadn't felt in months. He didn't want to think about why. The boundaries of their unspoken rules continued to blur, inch by reluctant inch. Callum tied off his cattle with a complex mountain knot, a legacy of a stubborn old rancher who had taught him his first year on the ridge. It was a secure knot, but it took precious seconds to tie and even longer to undo with cold, stiff fingers. On Friday, he watched Nora secure the roan horse to the post. She used a simple slip hitch. It held just as fast, but a single sharp tug on the tail end freed the animal instantly. Callum saw it. He knew it was better. A fire might sweep a barn in minutes. A quick release was the difference between a saved herd and a slaughterhouse. He said nothing. But the next day, when he tied the mules, his fingers awkwardly formed the slip hitch. He knew she saw him do it. She didn't smile, and she didn't comment. Their work became a strange, synchronized dance of avoidance and collision. When they repaired the rotting western fence, Callum started on the left, moving right, as he always did. Nora walked 50 yards down the line and started at the worst of the wreckage, working backward. For 2 hours, the only communication between them was the rhythmic crack of hammers and the squeal of stretched wire. They met in the middle. He handed her a handful of iron staples. She handed him the wire cutters. Their fingers brushed, the briefest, roughest friction of calloused skin against calloused skin. Callum pulled his hand back a fraction of a second faster than necessary. The physical toll of the ranch was brutal, but Nora never asked for leniency. Late in the second week, they were moving feed in the main barn. The air was thick with the dusty, sweet smell of old hay and damp earth. Callum hoisted a 50-pound sack of grain onto his shoulder, his back protesting the familiar strain. He turned to grab another, fully intending to do the heavy lifting himself. He stopped. Nora had taken a rusted iron ring, a length of sturdy hemp rope, and a carabiner she had found in the tack room. In less than 10 minutes, she had rigged a rudimentary pulley system over the loft beam. She hooked the rope around a sack, leaned her weight back, and hoisted the grain upward with half the effort. Callum stood frozen. It was basic mechanics. He had read about it in a textbook at a university library in Boston 20 years ago. Yet for 10 years, he had been breaking his own spine, hauling grain step by step. He watched the muscles in her forearms flex beneath her rolled-up sleeves. He felt a sudden, inexplicable surge of irritation, not at her, but at himself, for letting his stubbornness blind him to something so simple. The cold arrived in November, vicious and sudden. The temperature plummeted below zero overnight. The water trough froze solid, but worse, the mechanism of the primary well iced over. Callum went at it with a heavy iron crowbar, his breath smoking, his temper fraying as the metal clanged uselessly against the thick ice. Nora walked up, her face flushed with the biting wind. "If you strike it like that, you'll crack the iron casing," she said, her voice raising to be heard over the gale. "I can heat some water on the stove. We pour it slowly over the gears." "We don't have time to boil water," Callum snapped, slamming the crowbar down again. "The cattle need water now." Nora didn't argue. She stepped back, her expression unreadable, and went to the barn. An hour later, the ice gave way. But just as she predicted, the brittle iron casing of the gear cracked under the force of Callum's blows. It took him 3 agonizing hours in the freezing wind to patch the cast iron with wire and resin. When the second, smaller well near the lower pasture froze 2 days later, Callum didn't touch the crowbar. He walked into the kitchen, put a large kettle on the stove, and waited. They never spoke of it. But the silence between them was changing. It was losing its hostility, thickening into something heavier. On a Sunday afternoon, the sky a bruised purple, Callum stepped out onto the porch. Nora was on the roof of the loafing shed, securing a loose sheet of tin before the snows came. The wind was fierce, whipping her dark hair out of its tight knot. The pitch of the roof was dangerous, slick with frost. Callum's heart gave a sudden hard thud against his ribs. He stepped off the porch, intending to yell at her to get down, to let him do it. But he stopped in the yard. He watched her. She moved with an innate, grounded balance. She didn't hesitate. She drove the nails in with confident, ringing strikes, leaning into the wind rather than fighting it. She looked like she belonged there, suspended between the unforgiving earth and the breaking sky. Callum stood in the freezing dirt, watching her for much longer than was necessary. When she finally swung her leg over the edge to climb down, he quickly turned and went back inside, his chest tight with a sudden terrifying realization. He was starting to look for her when she wasn't in a room, and that was far more dangerous than the bank. Eldon Voss was not a monster. If he had been a monster, it would have been easier for Callum to hate him. Voss arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, the wheels of his polished black buggy cutting deep ruts into the half-frozen mud of the driveway. He was 52, impeccably dressed in a wool suit that smelled faintly of bay rum, and he carried the exhausted, slightly apologetic posture of a man who was simply doing a job he didn't particularly enjoy. He didn't come alone. Sitting beside him in the buggy, wrapped tightly in a thick blanket, was his 14-year-old daughter, Clara. Her face was pale, one side of her jaw swollen, and she was crying softly. Callum walked out to meet them, his posture rigid. He wiped the dirt from his hands onto his canvas pants. "Callum," Voss greeted, tipping his bowler hat. He glanced nervously at his daughter. "Forgive the intrusion. The dentist in Denver is booked until Friday, and her tooth is giving her hell. I couldn't leave her home alone." "Mr. Voss," Callum said, his voice flat. "Come inside." Voss left the girl in the carriage, assuring her he would only be a moment. He followed Callum into the kitchen. Callum gestured to the dining table, the table he had avoided for years until Nora forced his hand. Voss sat down, placing a leather portfolio on the scarred wood. He unclasped it, pulling out the deed and a ledger. $2,200, Callum, Voss said quietly, tapping the paper. "You have 47 days left. If the draft isn't cleared by the Territorial Bank by noon on the final day, the state authorizes me to foreclose on the 340 acres of the western spread." Voss looked up, his pale eyes entirely lacking malice. That was the worst part. "I don't want the land, Callum. The bank doesn't want to run a cattle operation. I know Daniel loved this place. I know you sacrificed your career for it." Voss sighed, rubbing his temples. Listen to me. If you can liquidate enough stock to pay exactly half, $1,100 before the deadline, I can personally authorize a 6-month extension on the remainder. It's the best I can do. It's more than I should do. It was a genuine lifeline. It wasn't a trap. It was the pragmatism of a desperate businessman trying to save a failing account. But to Callum, who had just spent the last week rationing oats to keep his herd alive, $1,100 might as well have been $1 million. I'll have the money, Eldon, Callum lied, his voice betraying nothing. You'll have it by the deadline. Voss nodded, packing his papers away. He looked like he wanted to say more, to offer pity, but he knew better. He stood up and walked out to the porch. As they stepped outside, they both stopped. Nora was standing beside the buggy. She hadn't been in the yard when Voss arrived. She must have come from the lower pasture. She was speaking softly to the weeping teenager, her voice a low, soothing hum that Callum couldn't quite hear over the wind. In Nora's hands was the small jar. She opened it, extracting a dark, paste-like substance, cloves and some crushed root Callum didn't recognize. Using a clean rag, she gently instructed the girl to press it against her inflamed gum. "Keep it there," Nora murmured, her voice carrying across the yard for the first time. "It will burn for a moment, and then it will go numb. It won't cure it, but it will let you sleep until you reach the city." The girl nodded, her tears slowing as the herbal remedy took immediate effect. Eldon Voss stepped off the porch, staring at Nora, his brow furrowed. He didn't look at her the way men usually looked at a lone woman in a canvas coat. He looked at her with a sudden, sharp recognition. His eyes darted to her face, to the way she held her shoulders, and then down to the worn leather bag slung across her hip. "Thank you, miss," Voss said slowly, his voice laced with an undeniable undercurrent of curiosity. Do I know you from Denver?" Nora turned. Her expression was perfectly smooth, an unreadable mask of polite indifference. "I don't believe so, sir. I just arrived from the East a few months ago." Voss lingered for a second too long. "My apologies. You remind me of someone." He tipped his hat again, climbed into the buggy, and drove away. Callum stood on the porch watching the buggy disappear. He had seen the look on Voss's face. He had seen the microscopic tightening of Nora's jaw when the banker asked his question. He filed the moment away in the dark, paranoid corners of his mind, alongside the slip knot and the pulley system. 3 days later, the paranoia finally caught fire. Callum was in the old tool shed attached to the side of the barn, searching for a coil of heavy hemp rope to secure a loose wagon axle. The shed was a disaster of rust and forgotten ambitions, filled with crates Daniel had packed and Callum had never opened. He moved a heavy box of rusted horseshoes, knocking over a stack of rotted wooden planks. Beneath the planks, flush against the dirt floor, was a small, brass-bound cedar box. Callum frowned. He didn't recognize it. It wasn't his, and it certainly wasn't his brother's style. He knelt, wiping away a decade of dust, and pried the unlatched lid open. Inside, nestled beneath a layer of oiled canvas, lay a small, leather-bound notebook. Callum picked it up. The leather was supple, well cared for. He opened the cover. On the first page was a meticulously hand-drawn topographic map of the entire 300-acre property. It was breathtakingly accurate. Every elevation, every ridge, every cluster of pines was marked with neat architectural handwriting. It wasn't his handwriting, it wasn't Daniel's. Callum turned the page. The entries were written in black ink, detailing the soil quality of the lower pasture, the seasonal water flow of the eastern spring, and the grazing patterns of the local wildlife. He looked at the dates at the top of the pages. April 12, 1874, September 3, 1875. Callum felt the blood drain from his face, leaving his skin cold. He and Daniel hadn't bought this land until 1868. These notes were made years before they ever set foot on this mountain. This wasn't a surveyor's log. This was the intimate, obsessed diary of someone who had lived here, breathed this air, and studied the dirt as if it were a holy text. He stared at the neat handwriting. He thought about Nora. He thought about her first day when she had walked straight to the secondary well without him pointing it out. He thought about how she knew that cow number 7 always tried to break the southwest corner of the fence, anticipating the animal's movement before it even happened. He thought about how she asked about the structural integrity of the old silo, not as someone learning a new place, but as someone confirming a suspicion about an old one. Callum snapped the book shut. His heart hammered against his ribs, a violent, furious rhythm. That night at dinner, they ate a stew she had made from root vegetables and the last of the salted beef. The silence, which had grown almost comfortable over the past weeks, now felt suffocating. Callum watched her. He watched the way she held her spoon, the way she chewed her food with methodical grace. She didn't look at him. She was talking quietly about the weather, about needing to patch the northern roof before the blizzard hit. She knows, Callum thought, the realization ringing in his head like a struck bell. She already knows every inch of this place. He didn't ask her. He wasn't ready to hear the answer. If he asked her now, the fragile ecosystem of his survival would shatter. But as he sat across from the woman who was slowly, quietly piecing his ruined life back together, Callum Hare realized with terrifying clarity that he had let a ghost into his house, and he had absolutely no idea what she wanted from him. By the third week, the mountain had settled into a sullen, freezing gray. The kind of cold that didn't just chill the skin but seemed to seep into the marrow of the bone, making every movement a calculated effort. Callum needed nails, roofing tar, and a new coil of wire. Leaving Nora in charge of the herd, he hitched the mules to the wagon and made the agonizingly slow descent into Ridge Creek. The mud of the road had frozen into jagged ruts that threatened to snap an axle with every jarring mile. He spent an hour at Boggs's general store loading the heavy supplies in grim silence. Before leaving town, he crossed the muddy street to the post office, a cramped, wood-slatted add-on to the assayer's office. He rarely received mail, but he checked out of a lingering masochistic habit, perhaps waiting for the bank's final written death sentence. Mrs. Lena Marsh, a woman whose nose was permanently pinched as if smelling sour milk, looked up from her ledger. "Nothing for you, Callum," she said briskly. Then she paused, reaching under the counter. "But I do have this. For the woman staying up there with you. Miss Calloway. She sent word down with the farrier last week that she was expecting something." Callum froze. Calloway. He hadn't asked her last name. She hadn't offered it. Lena slid a small, heavy package across the counter. It was wrapped tightly in thick brown paper and secured with coarse twine. Callum stared at it. He looked at the return address stamped neatly in the upper left corner. It wasn't from a family member. It wasn't from a catalog company. Wells Fargo and Company Banking Depot, Denver, Colorado. Care of Harrison and Sterling, attorneys at law. "You'll see she gets it?" Lena asked, her eyes narrowing with thinly veiled town gossip. "I'll see she gets it," Callum muttered, shoving the package deep into his coat pocket. The ride back up the mountain took 3 hours, but to Callum it felt like 3 days. The heavy square of the package thumped against his ribs with every jolt of the wagon. Attorneys at law. Denver. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of a puzzle he didn't want to solve. The notebook in the shed, the flawless slip knot, the way she had looked at Eldon Voss, the banker. And now a package from a high-end Denver law firm. She wasn't a drifter. She wasn't a desperate woman looking for $6 a month. So what the hell was she doing hauling frozen water and shoveling manure on a dying ranch? When he finally pulled the wagon into the yard, the sky was already darkening into a bruised, violent purple. Nora was in the barn, her breath pluming in the lantern light as she finished brushing down the roan. Callum walked in, his boots heavy on the straw-covered dirt. He didn't say a word. He just reached into his coat, pulled out the package, and held it out. Nora stopped brushing. She looked at the package, then up at his face. For a fraction of a second, something like panic flashed in her slate-gray eyes, quickly swallowed by her usual stoicism. She took it. "Thank you," she said softly. Callum didn't leave. He stood there, his jaw clenched, waiting. Under his intense gaze, Nora pulled a small knife from her belt and cut the twine. She tore back the heavy brown paper. Inside was a small leather pouch and a folded piece of thick, watermarked parchment. As she pulled the pouch free, her fingers numb from the cold, The folded parchment slipped. It fluttered to the dirt floor, landing perfectly face up at Callum's boots. Neither of them moved. Callum looked down. It was a formal bank statement. The flickering lantern light illuminated the meticulously inked numbers at the bottom of the page. Account balance, $8,500. Callum felt the breath leave his lungs as if he'd been kicked by a mule. $8,500. It was a king's ransom. It was 4 times the debt that was about to cost him his home, his promise, and his honor. He slowly raised his eyes from the paper to Nora. She quickly bent down, snatching the paper from the dirt and shoving it into her pocket. Her cheeks were flushed, but she met his stare. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. Callum turned on his heel and walked out into the freezing wind. Dinner that night was a masterclass in suffocating silence. They sat at the table, the stew tasting like ash in Callum's mouth. The wood stove crackled, the only sound in the suffocating room. He looked at her hands, red, blistered, calloused from chopping his wood and tending his cattle. She was sitting on a small fortune, yet she had bargained her wages down to $6 a month to freeze on his mountain. She didn't need the money, she didn't need the job, she didn't need him. The realization should have been a relief, but instead it felt like a betrayal. He was a charity case. A morbid curiosity for a rich city woman playing at being a pioneer. He wanted to demand answers. He wanted to throw her bag out into the snow, but he remained silent, locked in the prison of his own pride. That night, the first true blizzard of the season hit. Callum awoke at 2 in the morning to the sound of the house groaning under the assault of the wind. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the direction of the loafing shed. He threw off his heavy wool blankets, instantly wide awake. He pulled on his boots and grabbed his lantern, stepping out into the freezing hallway. A floorboard creaked. At the other end of the narrow hall, a door opened. Nora stood there, fully dressed in her heavy canvas coat, a lantern in her own hand. She had heard it too. She was ready to work. They stood 20 feet apart in the dim, flickering light. The wind howled against the siding, threatening to tear the roof off. Callum looked at her. He thought of the $8,000. He thought of the notebook, but right now none of that mattered. The roof of the shed was giving way and the cattle were beneath it. He gave her a single sharp nod. She nodded back. Without a word, they walked out into the blinding, screaming white of the storm, side by side. By the 4th week, the snow was knee-deep and the tension in the house was wound so tight it felt ready to snap. The storm had passed, leaving behind a blindingly bright, frozen world, but the quiet inside Callum's chest was entirely gone. He couldn't stop watching her. He couldn't stop wondering. Every time she touched a tool, every time she offered him a plate of food, he felt the crushing weight of her secret wealth and his own absolute ruin. But the true breaking point didn't come from Nora. It came from the past. A federal courier made the trek up the mountain on a Tuesday afternoon, his horse exhausted, his face red from the bitter cold. He handed Callum a heavy envelope sealed with red wax. "Federal Court of Denver, Mr. Hare," the courier said, tipping his hat before turning his horse around. Callum stood on the porch, the envelope heavy in his gloved hands. He recognized the seal. He recognized the handwriting of his old law partner. He didn't open it in the kitchen. He walked down the hall to the small, dusty room he called his office, a room he hadn't used in 3 years. The desk was covered in a thick layer of dust, save for the clean rectangle where he used to keep his brother's legal files. Callum sat in the leather chair. It groaned under his weight. With hands that suddenly felt numb, he broke the red wax and pulled out the crisp legal documents. He didn't need to read the endless paragraphs of legal justification. His eyes immediately found the final decree at the bottom of the 2nd page. Appeal denied. Original ruling upheld. The disputed tract of land formerly belonging to Daniel Hare is hereby permanently yielded to the plaintiff. No further legal recourse is available. The paper slipped from his fingers, drifting to the dusty floor. It was over. The lawsuit he had fought for Daniel, the lawsuit he had bungled, the loss that had broken his brother's spirit right before his lungs gave out, was finally, permanently lost. The guilt he had carried for 10 years, the reason he had exiled himself to this freezing hell, had just been stamped with a federal seal of failure. He had given up his career, his youth, and his sanity to protect this mountain, believing that somehow, through sheer force of will, he could make things right. He couldn't. He was a failed lawyer, a failing rancher, and a failure of a brother. Callum put his elbows on the desk and buried his face in his rough, scarred hands. A dry, ragged sound tore from his throat, a sound he hadn't made in a decade. It wasn't a sob. It was the sound of a foundation cracking. The door hinge squeaked. Callum didn't look up. He didn't care. Callum. Nora's voice was quiet. He heard the clink of ceramic as she set a mug of hot coffee on the edge of the desk. She had seen the courier. She knew something was wrong. "Get out," Callum rasped, his voice muffled by his hands. She didn't move. She saw the papers on the floor. She saw the rigid, trembling line of his shoulders. "You haven't eaten since yesterday," Nora said softly, stepping closer. "Drink the coffee." The sheer normalcy of her tone, the gentle domesticity of the act, felt like a whip across his back. He didn't want coffee. He didn't want her charity, her pity, or her $8,000. Callum snapped. He threw his arm out, striking the mug. It flew off the desk, shattering against the wooden floorboards, sending scalding black coffee splashing across the dust. "I said get out!" Callum roared, leaping to his feet. The chair crashed backward. Nora flinched, but she didn't run. She stood her ground, her gray eyes wide but entirely unafraid. She looked at the shattered mug, then up at him. She didn't yell back. She simply knelt down and began picking up the jagged pieces of ceramic. "Stop it," Callum breathed, his chest heaving. "Stop cleaning up my messes. I don't need your help. I don't need your pity." Nora ignored him, reaching for a sharp shard near his boot. Without thinking, Callum reached down and grabbed her wrist to stop her. The moment his bare skin touched hers, a jolt went through him, violent and electric. He froze. She froze, looking up at him from the floor. Her skin was warm. Beneath his calloused fingers, he could feel the frantic, heavy beating of her pulse. 10 years of absolute, punishing isolation collapsed in a single second. Callum pulled her up. He didn't mean to. He didn't think. The suffocating grief and the unbearable pressure of the last month mutated instantly into a desperate, starving hunger. He crashed his mouth down onto hers. There was nothing gentle about it. It was a collision. It was the brutal, ragged act of a drowning man finally finding air. He tasted salt and bitter coffee, and the cold mountain wind that always seemed to cling to her. He backed her into the edge of the heavy oak desk, his hands tangling in her dark hair, knocking the pins loose. For a second she stiffened, a sharp intake of breath trapped between their mouths. And then she didn't push him away. Nora's hands came up, gripping the lapels of his heavy coat. She kissed him back with a fierce, answering heat, opening her mouth to him, matching his desperation with a sudden, shocking intensity. Her fingers slid up his neck, threading into his hair, pulling him closer as if she too had been starving. It was an explosion in the dark. It was everything he had denied himself, everything he had sworn he didn't need, burning him alive. And then the instinct of survival kicked in. Callum tore himself away. He stumbled backward, his chest heaving as if he had just run 10 miles. He wiped the back of his hand across his mouth, his eyes wide with a sudden, absolute terror. Nora stood against the desk, her lips swollen, her hair falling around her shoulders. She was breathing heavily, her eyes locked on his, dark and searching. She took a half-step toward him. "Callum, don't," he choked out, holding up a shaking hand. The heat in his veins vanished, replaced by an icy, sickening panic. He had lost control. He had let the wall crumble. If he let her in, if he let himself feel this, the pain of eventually losing her, of losing everything, would kill him. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more stories that stay with you long after they end. He looked at her, forcing the hardest, coldest mask he owned onto his face. "You don't belong here," Callum said, his voice dropping to a harsh, jagged whisper. "You're a rich woman playing pioneer on a graveyard. This isn't a game, and I'm not your entertainment." Nora flinched as if he had struck her. The warmth drained from her face, leaving her pale and perfectly still. "Callum, that's not—" "Pack your bags," he interrupted, turning his back to her, unable to look at her eyes for a second longer. "You're leaving tomorrow at dawn." He didn't wait for her to answer. He walked out of the office, walked out the front door, and disappeared into the freezing white void of the mountain, leaving her standing alone in the ruins of his life. Dawn broke over the Colorado highlands like a bruised eye, purple and swollen with the threat of more snow. Callum had not slept. He had spent the night in the freezing barn, sitting on an overturned bucket, staring at the dirt floor until the shadows turned gray. The ghost of the kiss still burned on his mouth, a phantom heat that the sub-zero temperature could not extinguish. His knuckles were raw and bloody from where he had punched the wooden stall in a fit of self-loathing immediately after fleeing his office. He had broken the one rule that had kept him alive for 10 years. Do not feel. Now he had to finish the job. He had to excise the wound before it killed him. He walked out of the barn as the first pale sliver of sun crested the ridge. The wagon was already hitched. He had done it mechanically an hour ago, tying the mules with tight, unforgiving mountain knots, refusing to use the slip knot she had taught him. The front door of the house opened. Callum froze by the chopping block. He didn't turn around, but he heard the soft, steady crunch of her boots on the frosted grass. He picked up the heavy splitting axe, gripping the smooth hickory handle so tightly his forearms ached. He swung it down, burying the blade deep into a block of pine. "I packed my things," Nora said. Her voice was perfectly even. It lacked the heat of last night, lacked the desperate breathlessness that had passed between them when she had her hands in his hair. It was a voice drained of all color. Callum kept his back to her, resting his hands on the top of the axe handle. He didn't trust himself to look at her. If he looked at her, he might see the bruise of his rough kiss on her mouth. And if he saw that, the wall he was desperately trying to rebuild might shatter for good. "The mules are hitched," he said, his voice a gravelly monotone. "Leave the wagon at Boggs' stable in Ridge Creek. I'll pick it up next week. The stagecoach for Denver leaves at noon." "I know," she replied. A heavy, suffocating silence fell between them, broken only by the whistling wind. Callum waited for her to walk to the wagon. He prayed for her to walk to the wagon. Every second she stood there was tearing another hole in his chest. Instead of footsteps retreating, he heard her step closer. Something hit the flat top of the chopping stump beside his axe with a soft, leathery thud. Callum's eyes flicked downward. It was the brass-bound cedar box from the shed. The lid was open. Inside rested the small leather notebook he had found 3 days ago. "You knew about it," Nora said quietly. "I saw the dust disturbed in the shed. You found it, and you've been looking at me like I was a thief ever since." Callum's jaw tightened. "I don't care what you are, Miss Calloway. I just want you off my mountain." "Calloway," she repeated, the name tasting bitter in the frigid air. "Marcus Calloway was my grandfather. He owned this land for 15 years. He built the foundation of that house you hide in. He dug the well you cursed at." Callum finally turned his head, his brow furrowed. He didn't speak, but his eyes demanded the rest. Nora met his gaze squarely. She looked exhausted, her gray eyes shadowed, but she did not look defeated. She possessed a quiet, towering dignity that made Callum feel incredibly small. "When he got sick, he sold the land to your brother Daniel, because he needed the money to travel back east," Nora continued, her words clipped and precise. "He died before he ever made it to the train station. For the last 7 years, I've lived in Denver, managing an estate and a shipping company I inherited from an uncle. I have more money than I will ever need, and I have hated every single day of it." She looked past Callum out toward the sweeping snow-covered valley. "My grandfather never stopped talking about this place. He wrote me letters about the sunrise over the eastern ridge. He wrote about the smell of the pines. When he died, I didn't come here to steal your land, Callum. Legally, I have no right to it, and I wouldn't take it if I did." She brought her gaze back to him, and for the first time her voice cracked, just a fraction. "I came because I wanted to see if the place he loved so much was real. I came to see if maybe, just maybe, I could belong to a place like this." Callum stared at her, the truth washing over him like ice water. She wasn't a spy. She wasn't a bored socialite playing a game. She was exactly like him. A person drowning under the weight of a dead man's memory, looking for a place to anchor herself. She had taken less pay because the money meant nothing to her. She had stayed because she loved the land. And she had kissed him back because she had wanted him. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He opened his mouth, a desperate apology rising in his throat. He could tell her to stay. He could pull her into his arms right now and beg for forgiveness. But then he looked at his rough, bloodied hands. He looked at the peeling paint of the dying house. He remembered the federal court decree sitting on his desk, sealing his absolute failure. He was ruined. He had nothing to offer a woman who had $8,000 in the bank and the world at her feet. If he kept her here, he would only drag her down into the miserable, freezing dark of his own making. He had to be cruel. It was the only way to save her. "You found it," Callum said, his voice devoid of all warmth. "The land is real. But the man who owned it is dead, and so is my brother." Nora stared at him, searching his face for a crack, for a sign of the man who had kissed her with such devastating hunger the night before. But Callum had locked the door and thrown away the key. His face was a mask of stone. The hope slowly drained from her eyes, replaced by a profound, hollow sorrow. "You're right, Callum," Nora whispered. "The men who loved this mountain are dead. But I was foolish enough to think one of them might still be alive." She didn't wait for him to respond. She turned, her worn canvas bag slung over her shoulder, and walked to the wagon. She climbed up, took the reins in her bare hands, and snapped them. The mules lunged forward. The heavy wooden wheels broke the ice on the frozen mud, a sharp cracking sound that echoed like a gunshot. Callum stood perfectly still by the chopping block. He watched the wagon roll down the winding mountain path. He watched until it disappeared behind the tree line. He listened until the sound of the wheels faded into nothing but the rush of the wind. He was alone. He had won. He had successfully defended his isolation. The mountain was his again. Callum dropped the axe. He fell to his knees in the frozen dirt, wrapped his arms around his chest, and bowed his head, unable to draw a breath around the agonizing, suffocating pain tearing him apart from the inside out. 7 days. 168 hours since the wagon had disappeared down the ridge. The silence had returned to the mountain, but it was no longer the familiar stoic silence of the past 10 years. This silence was venomous. It was an active, malevolent thing that crawled into his ears and mocked him. It was the deafening roar of absence. Callum was losing his mind. He had expected the pain. He had prepared for the guilt, but he had not anticipated the physical withdrawal. He was a man who had survived a decade on routine, but Nora had unknowingly overwritten every single one of them. He walked into the barn, intending to harness the roan. He reached for the rope, and his fingers brushed the slip knot she had tied on the spare post. He stood there for 20 minutes, just staring at the woven hemp, his chest rising and falling in shallow, jagged breaths. He went into the kitchen to make coffee. He stood by the stove to eat his salted pork, refusing to sit at the table. But the empty chair across the room seemed to scream at him. He could see her sitting there, her dark hair catching the morning light, her slate-gray eyes watching him with that calm, unnerving intelligence. He threw the plate against the wall. It shattered, raining ceramic shards and grease onto the floor. He didn't clean it up. He stepped over it like a madman in a ruined castle. But the worst was the night. When the sun went down and the temperature dropped, the memory of her became a physical weight. Callum lay in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, shivering despite the heavy wool blankets. He could still taste her. It was a curse. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in the dusty office. He felt the terrifying electric jolt of grabbing her wrist. He felt the softness of her mouth parting under his, the frantic grip of her hands in his hair. The memory was so vivid, so visceral, it made his stomach clench and his blood burn. He touched his own lips in the dark, his hand trembling. "I was foolish enough to think one of them might still be alive." Her parting words played on a loop in his mind, stripping the flesh from his bones. On the 8th day, the fever broke. Not a sickness of the body, but a sudden, violent clearing of his mind. Callum was out by the eastern fence line. It was the section they had repaired together, working from opposite ends until they met in the middle. He was trying to drive a staple into a frozen post. His hand slipped. The hammer came down hard on his thumb, splitting the skin and crushing the nail. Blood welled up bright and hot against the freezing air. Callum dropped the hammer. He looked at his bleeding hand. 10 years ago, he had held his dying brother's hand and promised not to let them take the land. He had kept that promise. He had fought the bank, the weather, and his own sanity. But as he stood there, bleeding onto the frozen dirt, the absolute absurdity of his existence crashed down on him. Daniel was dead. Daniel didn't care about the eastern fence line. Daniel didn't care about Eldon Voss or the Territorial Bank. Daniel had wanted Callum to live, and Callum had spent a decade building a mausoleum. He had pushed away the only warm, living, breathing thing that had walked into his life because he was too terrified of failing her the way he had failed his brother. He had chosen the ghosts over a future, no more. Callum turned his back on the broken fence. He didn't pick up the hammer. He walked back to the house, his strides long and purposeful. He went to the wash basin in the kitchen and poured freezing water over his head, washing away the dirt and the madness of the past week. He wrapped a rag around his bleeding thumb. Then he walked into his bedroom and pulled open the bottom drawer of his dresser. Beneath a pile of moth-eaten woolen socks lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Callum pulled it out and unwrapped it. Inside was the charcoal gray wool suit he had worn the day he left his law firm in Denver 10 years ago. It smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. He stripped off his canvas work clothes, the uniform of his self-imposed exile. He put on the suit. The trousers were a little loose. He had lost weight over the years, his muscles hardening into lean, unforgiving cord, but the coat still fit across his broad shoulders. He walked to the clouded mirror above the wash basin. Staring back at him was not the broken, feral mountain man who had yelled at a woman for cleaning up his broken coffee mug. It was Callum Hare, a man who had lost a great deal, but who had finally realized what he was no longer willing to lose. He walked into the office. He picked up the federal court decree from the desk, folded it neatly, and threw it into the roaring fire. He watched the wax seal melt, and the paper turn to ash. He didn't write a note. He didn't pack a bag. Callum walked out to the barn and threw a saddle onto the roan horse. He didn't use the mountain knot to secure the saddlebags. He tied a perfect, flawless slip hitch. He led the horse out into the blinding glare of the winter sun. The air was razor sharp, but for the first time in a decade, Callum didn't feel the cold. He swung up into the saddle. He wasn't riding down to Ridge Creek to beg for an extension from the bank. He wasn't riding down to buy roofing nails. He pulled the reins, turning the roan east toward the treacherous mountain pass that led to the city. He was going to Denver. He was going to walk into whatever gilded high society mansion she lived in, with his scarred hands and his ruined pride, and he was going to tell her the truth. He was going to get his life back. The journey to Denver took 3 days of hard, punishing riding. Callum pushed the roan through the treacherous mountain passes, descending from the pristine, frozen silence of the highlands into the choking sprawl of civilization. Denver in 1878 was a beast of brick, iron, and coal smoke. It was loud, crowded, and smelled of horse manure, roasting peanuts, and industrial desperation. Callum rode through the muddy streets, his 10-year-old wool suit covered in a fine layer of trail dust. He drew stares. He was a man of the wilderness superimposed onto a city canvas. His face was weathered into harsh lines, his jaw covered in rough stubble, and his eyes held the dangerous, unwavering focus of a predator tracking a scent. He didn't care about the carriages that swerved to avoid him, or the well-dressed pedestrians who hurried onto the boardwalks. He had an address. He had memorized it from the heavy parchment envelope he had handed her days ago. He found the estate on Capitol Hill. It was a sprawling Victorian monstrosity of red brick, wrought iron fencing, and manicured hedges that had already succumbed to the winter frost. It looked like a fortress. Callum dismounted, tying the roan to an iron hitching post forged in the shape of a lion's head. He didn't bother dusting his coat. He walked up the sweeping stone steps and gripped the heavy brass knocker, slamming it down twice. The door opened to reveal a butler in a crisp black waistcoat, whose expression immediately morphed from professional neutrality to profound disdain. "Deliveries are to the rear of the house, sir," the butler said, moving to shut the heavy oak door. Callum planted his leather boot squarely against the door frame. The wood groaned under the sudden, immovable force. "I'm not delivering," Callum said, his voice a low, gravelly threat. "I'm looking for Nora Calloway. Miss Calloway is not receiving callers, especially not—" Callum didn't wait for the man to finish. He shoved the door open, the sheer physical force of a man used to hauling 50-pound sacks of grain, tossing the butler backward. Callum stepped into the grand foyer. The air was stiflingly warm, smelling of beeswax, imported lilies, and stagnant wealth. "Sir, you cannot—" "Callum?" The voice came from the parlor to his right. Callum turned. The room was draped in heavy velvet and gilded mirrors. Sitting on a tufted silk sofa was a woman in a high-collared, pale blue dress adorned with intricate lace. Her dark hair was pinned up flawlessly, not a single strand out of place. She looked like a portrait of high society perfection. She looked absolutely suffocated. Nora stood up, her slate-gray eyes wide with shock. For a second, the aristocratic mask held, and then it shattered. Her breath hitched. Sitting across from her was an older woman with a severe face and a teacup halfway to her mouth. "Nora, who is this ruffian?" the woman demanded, scandalized. Nora didn't answer her aunt. She didn't look at the sputtering butler. Her eyes were locked entirely on Callum. Callum walked into the parlor, his muddy boots sinking into the expensive Persian rug. He stopped 3 feet from her. He looked at the silk dress, at the gilded cage she lived in. It was exactly the life he had assumed she had. It was the life he had told himself she belonged to. Looking at her now, he realized how incredibly blind he had been. She looked like a ghost in this room. "Callum," Nora breathed, stepping forward, her hands trembling slightly as they clutched the folds of her silk skirt. "What are you doing here?" He didn't offer a polite greeting. He didn't apologize for his intrusion. He looked at her with a raw, burning intensity that made the older woman in the room gasp. "The water trough is frozen," Callum said, his voice rough, "and cow number 7 broke the southwest corner of the fence again." Nora stared at him, a sudden desperate hope flaring in her eyes. "Callum." "I fixed the fence," he continued, taking a step closer, erasing the distance between them. "I used the slip knot on the roan. I tried to eat breakfast at the table, but the chair across from me was empty, and the silence was deafening." He reached out, his calloused, scarred hand hovering just inches from her delicate lace sleeve. "10 years ago, I made a promise to a dying man," Callum said, his voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper meant only for her. "I promised to keep the land, and I did. I built a wall around that mountain, and I buried myself alive behind it. I wanted no one. I needed no one." His jaw tightened, the memory of his miserable, sleepless nights flashing in his eyes. "But then a woman walked onto my property, demanded $6 a month, and started tearing my walls down without asking permission. I pushed you away because I thought if I let myself feel anything, the grief would finally kill me." He finally closed the distance, his large hands gently framing her face, uncaring of the mud or the scandal. "But you leaving is what killed me, Nora. I can keep my promise to the dead, but I cannot let go of the living. I can't let go of you." The teacup clattered against the saucer as Nora's aunt dropped it in horror. "Nora, step away from that man this instant." Nora didn't hear her. A tear broke free, tracking down her pale cheek, but a fierce, radiant smile broke across her face. It was the first time Callum had ever seen her truly smile, and it hit him like a physical blow to the chest. "I told you," Nora whispered, her hands coming up to grip his wrists, her thumbs brushing over his pulse. "I don't quit." "Then come home," Callum commanded softly. Nora didn't hesitate. She didn't look back at the velvet sofa, or her aunt, or the gilded mirrors. She turned, walking swiftly out of the parlor and up the grand staircase. 10 minutes later, she came back down. The silk dress was gone. She wore her faded canvas work pants, the heavy, oversized wool coat, and the scuffed leather boots. She carried the single, weathered canvas bag. She looked like she was breathing real air for the first time in a week. "Nora Calloway," her aunt shrieked from the parlor doorway. "If you walk out that door with this savage, you are abandoning your legacy. You are throwing away your life." Nora paused at the front door. She looked over her shoulder at the sprawling, wealthy tomb she had inherited. "No, Aunt Clara," Nora said, her voice ringing with absolute, unshakable clarity. "I'm finally going to start it." She walked out the heavy oak door. Callum followed, his chest lighter than it had been in a decade. He didn't look back as he pulled the door shut, the heavy latch clicking into place, severing her from Denver forever. He lifted her onto the back of the roan, climbing up into the saddle in front of her, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, her face pressing into the rough wool of his coat. Callum spurred the horse forward, turning his back on the city, and headed back up the mountain. 6 weeks later, the transaction was almost insultingly anticlimactic. Eldon Voss sat at the kitchen table nursing a cup of hot coffee. Callum slid a bank draft across the scarred wood. It wasn't for $1,100, it was for the full $2,200. Callum had sold 20 head of cattle to a buyer in Denver, a contact Nora had casually provided during their ride back. Furthermore, he had signed a legal agreement granting Voss's Lower Valley cattle operation limited access to the eastern spring runoff during the dry season in exchange for a premium fee that covered the rest of the debt. Voss looked at the draft, then at the water rights contract. He stamped the heavy red seal of the territorial bank onto the foreclosure notice, writing "paid" in full across the parchment. "You're a stubborn son of a bitch, Callum," Voss said, sliding the canceled debt back across the table. He looked past Callum to where Nora was quietly kneading bread dough at the counter. He smiled faintly. "But it seems you finally found some sense." Voss left 10 minutes later. There was no dramatic music, no cheering crowd, just the sound of buggy wheels fading down the drive and the quiet crackle of the wood stove. Callum picked up the foreclosure notice. He walked over to the stove, opened the heavy iron door, and tossed the paper inside. The flames devoured it in seconds, turning the threat that had haunted him for 10 years into fragile white ash. He turned around. Nora was wiping flour from her hands with a rag. Callum walked over to her. He didn't say anything. He just wrapped his arms around her waist, pulled her flush against his chest, and buried his face in the crook of her neck. She smelled like yeast, wood smoke, and the sharp, clean mountain air. Nora leaned back into him, her hands coming up to rest over his, her thumbs tracing the scars on his knuckles. Life on the ranch continued, but the fundamental gravity of the place had shifted. They were no longer two people working on the same mountain. They were a singular force. The suffocating silence had been replaced by a comfortable, living quiet. They didn't need to talk to communicate. When a blizzard hit in early December, they worked shoulder to shoulder in the barn, moving hay and breaking ice. When Callum hoisted a 50-pound sack of grain, he didn't do it alone. He hooked it to the pulley system Nora had built, and they hoisted it together. When he reached for a tool, she was already handing it to him. The physical distance between them had completely vanished. If he was chopping wood, she would walk past and trail a hand lightly across his shoulder. If she was reading by the fire, he would sit on the rug beside her chair, resting his arm across her knee. The desperate, violent hunger of their first kiss in the office had mellowed into a deep, consuming fire that kept the winter cold entirely at bay. The first true, heavy snow of the season began to fall on a Tuesday evening. It was a quiet snow, the large, fat flakes drifting down from a slate-gray sky, rapidly burying the jagged edges of the mountain under a smooth, white blanket. Callum and Nora sat on the small wooden porch, wrapped in thick wool blankets. The wind was calm, the air possessing that unique, muffled stillness that only comes with heavy snowfall. Callum held a mug of black coffee. Nora leaned against his side, her head resting on his shoulder. They watched the valley below slowly disappear into the white. Callum reached into the deep pocket of his coat. His fingers brushed the smooth leather of the small book he had carried with him for the past month. He pulled it out. Nora shifted, looking down at the notebook resting on his thigh. It was her grandfather's journal, the book that had held the secrets of the land, the book she had left on the chopping block the day she thought she was leaving forever. Callum handed it to her. "I think this belongs to someone who knows what it means," he said quietly, his voice a low rumble against her ear. Nora took the book, her fingers tracing the embossed leather cover. She opened it to the first page, looking at the meticulous hand-drawn map of the property. The spring, the pastures, the house. She looked up at him, her gray eyes reflecting the pale light of the snow. "You want me to keep it?" she asked softly. Callum looked at her face. He saw the strength in her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes, the woman who had walked into a graveyard and planted a garden. He didn't have a diamond ring. He didn't have a grand speech. He only had the truth of the dirt beneath their feet. "I want you to stay here long enough that you don't need it," Callum said, his gaze locking with hers. "I want you to know every inch of this mountain by heart. I want you to know it because it's yours, because this is your home." It wasn't a formal proposal, but Nora understood the weight of the words. It was the surrender of a man who had defended his borders with his life, throwing the gates wide open and handing her the keys. Nora didn't say yes. She didn't need to. She smiled, a slow, breathtaking expression of pure contentment. She closed the leather notebook and reached forward. Instead of putting it in her pocket, she placed it on the wooden floorboards of the porch right between them, where the snow would soon cover it. She didn't need the map anymore. She had already found exactly where she belonged. She leaned up, pressing her mouth to his. The kiss was slow, deep, and tasted of coffee and the freezing winter air. Callum's arm tightened around her, pulling her onto his lap, holding her against the endless white of the mountain. The snow continued to fall, burying the past, burying the debts, and leaving only the quiet, unbreakable warmth of two people who had finally stopped fighting the cold and learned to survive it together. Spring came to the Colorado Highlands not with a gentle whisper, but with a violent, muddy roar. The snowmelt turned the mountain paths into treacherous rivers of brown sludge, and the biting wind of winter surrendered to the sharp, wet smell of new pine and thawed earth. For the first time in 10 years, the shifting of the seasons did not fill Callum with a sense of impending doom. It filled him with purpose. The herd had survived the winter, their numbers bolstered by the calves born in late March. The ranch was no longer a dying monument to the past. It was a breathing, demanding entity. They needed more room. On a bright Tuesday morning in late April, Callum was behind the main barn, driving a heavy iron spade into the earth to dig the foundation trench for a new loafing shed. He worked stripped down to a canvas shirt, his muscles burning with a familiar, welcome exhaustion. The sun beat down on his shoulders, warm and absolute. He drove the spade down 2 feet. The steel edge struck something that did not yield like root nor ring like stone. It was a dull, hollow thud. Callum frowned, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm. He cleared away the loose, wet soil with his hands. Buried deep in the clay was a small wooden box. It was no larger than his palm, the wood blackened and heavily rotted by years of damp earth. The brass latch had completely rusted away into a crust of orange oxidation. Callum pulled it free, weighing it in his dirty hands. It wasn't the cedar box he had found in the tool shed. This had been buried intentionally, placed beneath the frost line long before he or his brother had ever laid eyes on this mountain. Using the edge of his spade, he carefully pried the rotted lid open. The wood splintered easily. Inside, protected by the decaying shell, was a small bundle wrapped tightly in heavy waterproof oilcloth. The cloth was stiff but intact. Callum unwrapped it slowly, his thumbs thick and clumsy with dirt. Nestled in the center of the dark fabric were 2 simple, tarnished silver bands. They were unadorned, heavy with age. Beneath them lay a small square of heavy parchment. Callum picked up the paper. It was brittle, the edges yellowed, but the dark brown ink had survived the darkness of the earth. He read the looping, elegant script. For Clara, the one who stayed when I wanted to leave. For Jacob, the one who returned when I was sure you were gone. This land bears witness. M.C., 1861. Callum stared at the date. 1861. 17 years ago. The first bloody year of the Civil War. A time when the country was tearing itself apart and men were leaving their homes, many never to return. He looked at the initials, M.C. Marcus Calloway. He knew from the few stories Nora had shared over the winter that her grandmother's name had been Clara. But Nora had never mentioned a Jacob, perhaps a brother or a son who had marched off to a war in the East. Callum looked at the silver rings tarnished black by time. This wasn't just a buried trinket. It was an anchor. It was a vow made by a man and a woman who had stood on this exact patch of dirt, terrified of the world falling apart around them, choosing to bury a promise in the soil so the mountain would remember it, even if they didn't survive. Callum carefully wrapped the rings and the letter back in the oilcloth. He picked up his coat from the fence line and walked toward the house. The kitchen was warm, smelling of roasted chicory and baking bread. Nora was sitting at the dining table. The ledger books were spread out before her, her brow furrowed slightly as she calculated the budget for the summer feed. She looked entirely at peace, the harsh, defensive angles of her face from her arrival months ago softened by the firelight and the safety of the mountain. Hearing his boots on the floorboards, she looked up and smiled. "You're taking a break early. Did you hit bedrock?" Callum walked to the table. He didn't say anything. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the oilcloth bundle, and set it gently on top of the open ledger. Nora looked at it, then up at his face. "What is this?" "I was digging the trench for the south wall of the new shed," Callum said quietly. It was buried about 2 feet down. Nora reached out, her fingers unfolding the stiff cloth. She saw the tarnished silver rings first, her breath catching slightly. Then she picked up the brittle piece of paper. Callum watched her eyes track across the faded ink. He watched her read the names, the date, the initials of the grandfather who had loved this land so much. He had written to her about it until the day he died. Nora lowered the paper. Her hands were trembling slightly. She stared at the 2 silver bands resting on the dark canvas. "He never told me," she whispered, her voice thick with sudden emotion. "He told me about the sunrises and the smell of the pines, and how to tie a knot so a horse wouldn't panic. But he never told me about this." "Maybe it wasn't meant to be a story," Callum said. He stepped up behind her chair, resting his large, calloused hands on her shoulders. He looked down at the rings with her. "When people endure something that almost breaks them, when they have to choose to stay when everything in them is screaming to run, sometimes there aren't words for it," Callum murmured, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Sometimes you just have to give it to the ground. You trust the dirt to remember it for you." Nora leaned her head back against his chest, covering his hand with hers. She understood. She understood what Marcus and Clara had gone through in 1861, because she knew what she and Callum had gone through in the freezing dark of the past winter. This mountain didn't just grow pine trees and bitter grass. It grew resilience. It was a place where people who were broken came to plant themselves, hoping to grow roots deep enough that the wind could never tear them away again. "Do you want me to rebury it?" Callum asked softly. Nora looked at the letter for a long moment. Then she picked up the 2 silver rings. She handed one to Callum and she kept the other, closing her fist around the cold metal until it began to warm against her skin. "No," Nora said, turning to look up at him, her gray eyes clear and bright. "The earth remembered. Now it's our turn." Early the next morning, the fog rolled over the highlands. It was a thick, damp mist that clung to the barbed wire and muted the colors of the world, leaving only the sharp silhouettes of the pines and the sprawling expanse of the valley. It was the kind of morning that demanded silence. Callum stood at the far edge of the western pasture. The winter storms had been brutal on this section of the fence. A locust post had rotted through, and the wire was sagging dangerously low. He wore his heavy canvas coat against the morning chill. He wrapped the rusted wire around the iron tensioner, planting his boots firmly in the wet spring soil. He hauled back on the lever. The wire let out a high-pitched metallic squeal as it pulled taut, the exact same sound it had made on a freezing October morning, half a year ago. Callum held the heavy tensioner, feeling the tremendous strain of the iron. 6 months ago, he had stood in this exact spot entirely alone, He had listened to the wire scream, and his mind had been consumed by a nauseating arithmetic. He had been counting the days he had left. He had been counting the dollars he didn't have. He had been measuring the distance between his absolute failure and his brother's grave. He had wanted no one. He had believed that needing someone was a weakness that would ultimately destroy him. But as Callum held the wire taut, a pair of gloved hands reached out from beside him. Nora didn't ask if he needed help. She didn't wait for an invitation. She simply stepped up to the wooden post, holding a heavy iron staple and a hammer. With 3 precise ringing strikes, she drove the staple deep into the wood, securing the wire permanently in place. Callum slowly released the tensioner. The wire held firm. He looked at her. She was wearing her old canvas coat, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, the silver ring hanging from a leather cord around her neck tucked safely beneath her collar. She didn't say a word. She just gave him a small, knowing nod, and moved down the fence line to inspect the next post. Callum stood there, the morning fog swirling around his boots. He looked at the fence. He looked at the vast, sweeping land that stretched out before them, finally free of debt, finally free of the ghosts of the past. He wasn't counting anymore. There was no arithmetic left in his head. There was no timeline, no deadline, no fear of the encroaching winter. There was only the land, the quiet morning, and the woman walking a few paces ahead of him. Callum picked up his tools, adjusted his grip on the heavy iron, and walked forward to join her in the fog. He had spent 10 years holding his breath on this mountain. Finally, he could just breathe. Welcome to our channel, where we bring stories of the Wild West. Cowboys, love on the frontier, the bond between mothers and children, and the quiet compassion between people in the harshest lands. All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality.
What began as a story of debt, pride, and isolation slowly unfolded into something far more human, far more enduring. A man who believed that strength meant standing alone discovered that true strength lies in allowing someone to stand beside you. A woman who had everything the world could offer found that what she truly needed could not be bought, inherited, or claimed. It had to be built, with bare hands, in a place that demanded everything in return. This story is not simply about the Wild West. It is about the unseen battles people carry within them, the promises we make to the past, the guilt we refuse to release, and the walls we build to protect ourselves from pain. Callum held on to his brother's memory so tightly that he forgot how to live. He turned love into obligation, and duty into a prison. And in doing so, he nearly lost the one thing that could have truly saved him. Not the land, not the ranch, but connection. Nora, on the other hand, represents a different kind of courage. Not the loud, reckless kind, but the quiet, unwavering kind. The courage to stay, to endure, to give without asking, and to love without certainty. She stepped into a place that did not welcome her, into a life that demanded more than comfort, and she chose it anyway. Not because she had to, but because she believed something meaningful could grow there. And in the end, she was right. The deeper meaning of this story lies in the balance between holding on and letting go. We are often taught to honor the past, to keep our promises, to remain loyal to what once was. But there comes a moment when honoring the past must not come at the cost of the present. Callum's greatest transformation was not paying off his debt. It was realizing that he could not sacrifice his future to satisfy a memory. He learned that love for the dead should never outweigh responsibility to the living. There is also a powerful lesson here about worth. Nora asked for less than she deserved, not because she lacked value, but because she was driven by something deeper than money. And Callum, who believed himself to be worthless in the face of failure, could not understand that someone might choose him, not out of pity, but out of genuine connection. This reflects a truth many of us struggle with. We often measure our worth through success, through what we own or achieve, when in reality, our value is found in who we are willing to become for someone else. And perhaps most importantly, this story reminds us that healing does not come from isolation. It comes from friction, from challenge, from being seen by another person. The cold mountain did not change, but Callum did. The land did not become easier, but life became fuller. Because when two people choose to face hardship together, even the harshest winter can be endured. In the end, the ranch was never just land. It was a test, a place where grief, pride, love, and redemption all collided. And what survived was not just a home, but a partnership, a quiet understanding that no matter how unforgiving the world may be, warmth can still be found in shared silence, in small gestures, and in the simple act of staying. So if there is one thing to carry with you after this story, it is this. Do not let your past define the limits of your future. Do not let fear convince you that you are better off alone. And when life places someone beside you who sees beyond your walls, do not push them away. Because sometimes, the greatest risk is not in loving. It is in refusing to, and somewhere out there, beyond the noise of the world, where the wind still howls across open land, there are stories like this waiting to remind us that even in the coldest places, the human heart can still find its way home.